Okay, so this week, of course, has marked the 18th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, and I wanted to talk a bit about it because it's been particularly on my mind, and it's on my mind on every anniversary, but particularly this year. I don't know why more so this year, but it just has been. Um, there's a lot that can be said about 9/11, a lot that's already been said. I've got no personal connections with it. I didn't know anyone that was involved. I didn't have no direct connections with New York or New York City. Um, but it still affects me in a human way. And I think for my generation, it is an era defining thing. It's like the sinking of the Titanic. It's like Pearl Harbor. It's like the Kennedy assassination. It is something that I think will always, always, always be in the public psyche. And those images of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers are just we've seen them so many times, but they never fail to shock, and it's something that really is a defining fact of the millennial generation, um, as were the subsequent events afterwards. So, and I want to talk a bit about that. In actual numbers, we're now talking 6,570 plus days. So history is moving on, time is moving on, people will get older, and pain may numb, but I think the poignancy of the event will never go away. I want to talk a bit about the events afterwards, though. I mean, the event itself is well documented. We know the heroism of the firefighters, of the passengers on United 93, the harrowing, horrendous images of the people jumping from the towers, what their thoughts must have been to be in that sort of situation. Um, we know all the stories. I actually read earlier today about a Polish man who was murdered in Brooklyn that day, and his is the only murder in New York City on September 11th that has nothing to do with the attacks. Henryk Syriac, I think he was called, and it's never been solved because police resources were redirected to the event, understandably. So it's quite sad, I think, and that's never been solved. Um, I want to talk a bit about the war on terror, the response by President Bush, and the retrospectives that a lot of people have been making, overwhelmingly negative about the last 20 years, 18 years. Um, Firstly, I want to make a point here that's I feel not really mentioned enough. When Bush was in the White House, I was pretty critical of the president, and I remain critical of many avenues he take in his policy. I think he done too little on climate. I think he done too little on gun violence, and he had a lot of the characteristics of a Republican president that I don't align myself with. But I also think that the position that he was in, and I'm aware that people will say he had prior warnings, etc. But no other president in American history has been in that position to have faced such a devastating attack domestically, um, in that sort of situation. Okay, Roosevelt had Pearl Harbor, which was a major world-changing incident, but that was not even on the mainland. So I think this was a unique situation. So critics of Bush would need to consider that any president would have found themselves in that position and they would have had to show a tough resolve. One of the retrospective critiques is he should have declared it a crime, a criminal offence rather than an act of war. But the scale of that attack, to put things in context, the 1993 bombing, 6 people died. That was a major terrorist incident. In this incident, we're talking almost 3,000 killed, thousands more suffered post traumatic stress, injured, relatives, so the real toll of 9/11 goes well over 10,000 probably. And actually, it was a day in which 67 Britons died. 67 British nationals died that day. That's more than the London bombings. And it actually would make it, unless I'm mistaken, our second deadliest terror attack after Lockerbie. So it has a particular poignancy for this country as well. It was an attack foremost on the United States, there's no question about that. But I believe it was also an attack on the West and Western values. I believe also that the fact 87 nationalities were among the victims, it was an attack on humanity. Um, a lot of Dominicans, a lot of Indians also died in the disaster, in the atrocity. So to say that Bush should have simply declared it a criminal act, I think any president in his shoes would have had to show a tough resolve. And simply saying, oh, it's awful, we're going to call this a criminal action, I think people would have responded very angrily. I think they would have said, that's not taking on board the scale of this. It's not taking on board the fact that there was an Islamist declaration of war on the United States. And it's true that Al Qaeda wasn't a nation state, and that will forever be a controversial factor regarding the invasion of Iraq, because it was, of course, one of the reasons used to justify the disaster of the invasion. But I think the intervention in Afghanistan is different, and this is why. Firstly, it had far more UN approval. The world understood that America had a right to seek justice. The world understood that America was going to respond to that, and any nation. I contend that had that been 3,000 people killed in Moscow, or 3,000 people killed in Beijing, or 3,000 people killed in London or Tokyo, those governments would have also had a very, very tough resolve. And anyone that says they wouldn't is deluding themselves. The fact of the matter is, the Taliban regime shielded Al Qaeda. Now, people can argue about the politics. They can point out that American foreign policy supported the Mujahideen in the 80s, leading to the rise of Al Qaeda, and that's true. I think there is a lot of criticism, valid criticism, to be made of the Reagan foreign policy um, and Bush Sr.'s foreign policy. But those people who say that, oh, Bush was terrible, the invasion of Afghanistan, the intervention in Afghanistan, and let's not forget what the Taliban was and is. This was a sadistic regime that kept women as slaves, literally, banned music, hanged men for not having the right beard length. It was a savage, anti human, barbaric regime that had no legitimacy. It came to power through civil war, through coup d'etat. Um, so for the Taliban, it really disgusts me, I have to say, when people say, oh, well, the Taliban are just defending their homeland. They helped to destroy their homeland, along with the Soviet Union, something that RT would do well to remember when it points fingers at the West, that it was Russia's predecessor state that caused a lot of the mess in Afghanistan in the first place. The current phase of the war may have begun in 2001, and I'm not going to say it's been a success, totally. Although there has been things that have happened that wouldn't have happened under the Taliban. Women have stood in parliamentary elections. Girls have went to school. It remains a very grave situation. It's still a very violent place, and there's no sign of much progress in terms of the peace front. There has to be peace, but it really bothers me when people put all the blame on the West without attributing any blame to the Taliban for shielding Al Qaeda and for their inhumanity. So those people who say that there should never have been any intervention in Afghanistan, if you were in President Bush's shoes, what would you have done? Really? Because I find, and I was one of them. I was a big critic of Bush, and I still remain critical of some aspects of his presidency. But I do think this question needs to be asked: what would have been the right approach, other than the tough resolve that he took, which world leaders, by the way, signed up to initially? And it's true, the Bush administration went too far in thinking it could nation build from scratch. But I contend that, as the passage of time moves on, we can look at these things, and some people are looking at it now like, oh, it's been 18 years, it's been a disastrous war. Thousands of American servicemen have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, thousands more injured, thousands of civilians killed, and the cost ever mounting. It's going in the trillions. I think it's I think it's the most expensive war in American history. Um, so it's very hard to vindicate that unless you look at the situation of 2001, 2002. I do think there absolutely needs to be a move for peace now, but when people say there should have been no intervention, really, do you really think that would have been the right foreign policy move in light of the worst terrorist attack in human history? To not take action against a country that was providing safe haven for the terrorist group that committed this atrocity? I mean, of course, if you want to listen to Alex Jones or other conspiracy theorists, um, David Icke or whoever, I mean, even Oliver Stone, who's pretty patchy record and his political views, in my opinion, even he didn't get into the conspiracy theories with World Trade Center, which was a powerful film with Nicolas Cage. And I'm pleased he didn't. I'm pleased he didn't try to put any conspiracy theory angle on it because it was what it was. Those people who say it was an inside job and the passengers on the flights were paid actors. Let me just make one rebuttal to that. One thing they come out with is, oh, well, those voice messages don't sound that distressed. Well, the stewardesses were incredibly brave and they were trained in those sort of situations. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a real world event. It doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. And I think it is grossly disrespectful to suggest that all those flights, all those people who died on the flights, either didn't exist or were actors. People nitpick. They'll say, like, a relative speaking in an interview and they're smiling. That doesn't mean anything. People deal with grief in different ways. I think there's a lot of things we take from 9/11. Certainly the human spirit, people coming together, the sort of the way people came to New York City to donate blood and so on. So it was the best of the human spirit. It also showed the worst. There's no escaping that. And I think it was the beginning of what we have seen in an international toxic pan-Islamist ideology. I mean, it didn't begin with 9/11. There were Islamist attacks before 9/11, but I think it really woke the world up. And if you still, 18 years on, are churning out nonsense that, oh, don't criticize Islam, Islam can't be criticized, you really need to pay attention. Islamic extremism is part of Islam, just like the Crusades were part of Christianity, the Spanish Inquisition was part of Christianity. People who want to divorce extremism from a religion, they 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 think they're being open-minded, and it really bugs me when people say things like, "Oh, don't insult the religion." I will always, point out that you can't generalize all Muslims, and there's no excuse for hate crimes against Muslims. But it really angers me, quite frankly, when people come out with this idea that religious extremism has nothing to do with religion. Until and unless you can talk about the problem and the ideology, nothing's going to change. And those who say that it's just Western policy that causes Islamist attacks, well, where were the Sri Lankan troops in Iraq or Afghanistan? And yet that didn't stop Islamists slaughtering 250 people earlier this year. You know, um, Indonesia and a host of other countries have suffered Islamist attacks. Nigeria, that have not had, in fact, one of the worst atrocity since 9/11 was the Baga massacre in Nigeria in 2015. And I know Nigeria has a history of sectarian violence, but anyone that still, with a straight face, says that Islamist ideology is not a real thing, or oh, it's just terrorism, it's got nothing to do with Islam, you're deluded. You're frankly deluded. And it tends to be either Muslims who are in denial or people who are trying to virtue signal because they think to talk about Islamic extremism somehow equates to hating Muslims. It doesn't. It really doesn't. You know, unless you can name a problem, unless you can talk about a problem, then it isn't going to change. So I think that has been something we've learned from 9/11, the reality, the existence, and the threat of pan-Islamist extremism. There's been many other things as well, but that's certainly one of them. And I also think it has shown us that nation building is not something that can happen overnight. And foreign policy, when it involves nation building, is always going to be controversial. But I cannot agree that the notion of doing nothing is preferable. I mean, look at Rwanda. There was no outside intervention in Rwanda, at least not until the last minute, and we saw almost 1 million people killed. So those who, denounce Bush as a warmonger and so on, okay, that's your opinion, but what would you have done? Let me just put that out there. What would you have done? For people who buy into conspiracy theories, who believe everything Russia Today tells them, for people with that mindset will always believe that the West is to blame for all the world's problems and there's some sinister conspiracy. Now, I'm not naive. I'm not going to say that in the corridors of power there isn't corruption, and I'm not going to say that every single thing about 9/11 makes sense. But the idea there was like controlled explosions or it was an inside job. One of them is the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Oh no, Jews were killed in 9/11. Well, that can immediately be debunked. Just look at the 9/11 victims memorial. Look at the names. There were clearly Jewish people there. So it does bother me when people go down that line. Anyway, I'll round this up. Like I say, I don't think the poignancy of the event will ever be forgotten. I don't think the pain will ever go away from the relatives, but I think time, I do believe that time nullifies pain to an extent. And as we go into the 20th anniversary, the 25th anniversary, as time moves on, it will become more distant. But I understand the new World Trade Center tower number two is going to go up. I didn't realize that. Apparently, unless I'm mistaken, there's going to be a new set of twin towers. So there is the current one World Trade Center, but two World Trade Center. I think it would be a great homage to the original to have another set of twin towers, not looking like the original, new design, but I think that would be